Seed and Stone is the first piece in a series I'm doing exploring society's myths, the realities in which we live, and possible approaches to transformation. So, I grew up in California, and I am deeply disturbed by what's happening in the United States right now. So, it seemed prudent to look at the myth of American greatness. And I thought I'd start at the beginning and look at one of the earliest monuments in the US. The Washington Monument is in honor of the first US president, George Washington, and it's an obelisk. And I thought this was an interesting choice because obelisks have long been this architectural grammar of ancient empires, making a claim that they are great and permanent and, have some divine right to be doing what they're doing. Ancient Egypt did this. Obelisks honored the sun god Ra. They were these giant monoliths carved from a single piece of granite, usually, and lifted skyward. And later, Rome showed up and was like, hey, those are really cool. Let's steal them and bring them home with us. And that's exactly what they did. They brought a bunch of obelisks back to their own capital as these trophies of conquest. And so these monuments have long been this visual language of justifying dominance. And the US wanting to do an obelisk for George Washington, it just made me think, you are following in the footsteps of empires that believe might makes right and that progress is vertical and linear. But the construction of the monument itself challenges the idea that might makes right, because if you want to make something big, whether it's a society or an obelisk, you need a lot of cooperation. And they did not have that to do this monument. It took 85 years to complete. George Washington died in 1799, and they didn't even begin building until 1848. A lot of stuff happened. Funding came and went. There was a political party that briefly seized control of the building society. They did not like the Pope, so they took all the stone that he had donated and just chunked it into the Potomac River. Then, of course, there was the Civil War, and the monument was this stump of a beginning and surrounded by wartime cattle and slaughter operations. And then decades later, when they finally were able to resume construction, they couldn't use the same quarry. So they had to get their stone from somewhere else. And that is why you see this color shift about 150 feet off of the ground. It's this unintentional line of division, like branding the monument with interruption and struggle. Now, architects did ensure that when it finally was completed in 1884, it was the tallest structure in the world. It didn't get to keep that title long. Just 5 years later, the Eiffel Tower surpassed it, which is another monument full of controversy and also built on the idea that bigger is better and progress is vertical and linear. But what I gathered from reading about the history of the Washington Monument is just how hard it is to create a civilization out of alignment with the ecosystem and with the people. Despite the US starting foundational documents with phrases like, "we the people," there was a very small elite few who got to create the United States, create the institutions, and run the government. And they did it that way on purpose, and they kept it that way. this is why we're constantly receiving messaging that the way the US does things is the best way to do things, when in fact, we're working harder than we ever have in history, like around the planet. If you look at the history of work, we're working so many more hours because Q2 has to be better than Q1, right? Progress is linear, so everything has to be more, more, more. And the planet is being murdered, and everyone is competing for titles of greatness as individuals, because those titles hold the promise of status and monetary comfort, and like that's supposed to finally make life easier, right? And happier. And like, does that really end the rat race when we have the best title? But so, returning for a moment to colonial expansion, when all of this started, the idea that the United States is so great, what the colonizers came to in the mid-Atlantic region was this thriving ecosystem of near-continuous forest. Tulip poplars were among the tallest beings in that ecosystem, which, by the way, they're not actually poplars. They are in the magnolia family. Someone in the comments, please tell me why they're called poplars. Anyway, these trees, they still grow today and clearly get their name from the tulip-like blooms that they have in spring. And, you know, these forests were very dynamic. They were full of different tree species and soil microbes and a flourishing life on the forest floor. But colonists, with their ideas of what civilization meant and what progress and development meant, nearly erased these forests, because to them, development and progress are narrowly defined as the conversion of living systems into resources. So using nature instead of living with nature. The Washington Monument stands on land that was once home to the Alcoan-speaking peoples of the Chesapeake region. And these people, they had actually shaped the Chesapeake through fire and agriculture and seasonal movement. And what the colonists saw as this, quote, pristine wilderness, they thought untouched, was in fact a cultural ecosystem. Its abundance came because people were living in relationship with it, as opposed to trying to dominate it. The indigenous nations were actively managing the forests and the land through controlled burns, selective harvesting, agroforestry, rotational agriculture, and intentional encouragement of certain species. And what this produced was, forests had open understories, there were meadow-like clearings, abundant game habitat, and a lot of nut-producing trees like oak and chestnut and hickory, along with very comfortable travel corridors. So, when the colonizers came, there was the Piscataway Confederacy, which was a very powerful political and trade network that had been there for a very long time, long before they showed up. And they could have chosen to respect the existing frameworks and lifeways of indigenous people and learn to live with them in this place that's new to them. But instead, en masse, they largely chose violence. Now, a few individuals did choose to assimilate to indigenous communities. This was a phenomenon that rarely happened in the reverse. The colonizers, or the indigenous people, rarely wanted to live with the colonizers, and Benjamin Franklin in particular was fascinated by this phenomenon, so much so that he commented on it. But my purpose in raising it right now is not to say, oh, indigenous cultures are some kind of utopia. No one is perfect. But the asymmetry in which people shifted the society they wanted to live in challenged colonial myths of their cultural supremacy, and those challenges continue today. You know, all of our institutions are colonial legacy institutions. The United Nations, international environmental law, they are all still based on the colonial ideals of civilization and development, and of course that humans and nature are somehow separate, right? They ignore any other worldview. And the sad thing is, we could learn from these other worldviews to create a better society for all of us, to actually live in harmony with nature, which the UN has an entire page on, and they just propose doing it by slapping the word sustainable in front of development without actually questioning what either of those words mean. So it is really important to recognize that the myth of American greatness, it comes from a history of domination and violence, and it cannot be separated from the genocide of indigenous people, enslaved Africans, and environmental destruction that is putting the entire world in peril today. This obelisk, this monument, is standing on land violently remade, commemorating a slave-owning man who took their teeth for his dentures. And no, we can't say, oh, it was different back then. People didn't know. This does not fly with me because human beings did not just recently develop empathy. Everybody knew this was awful. Thomas Day, a British man, pointed out the hypocrisy and the ridiculousness of writing all men are created equal with one hand while holding a whip against enslaved people in the other hand. So building empires or civilization on dominance and ignoring our habitat only scales the greatness of suffering, not the greatness of the empire or the civilization. But if we look to what was there before, to the poplar trees, and to living in relationship and kinship with the environment, if we consider other worldviews, if we just consider the ecosystem, we can build something different. Poplar trees do grow absolutely massive, but their life supports more life. Their roots stabilize soil. They don't have lower branches because they're just creating a canopy. Their blooms support native pollinators every spring. Even when they die and fall to the forest floor, their decomposition continues to support life. It's cyclical. So while we cannot undo the histories that have shaped this land, what we can choose and what we can do are shaping the structures and the systems that we build now. And that's why I decided to represent all of this by putting the obelisk within a tulip tree flower. Because nothing we do happens outside an ecosystem. All of our empires, our wars, but also all of our families, our celebrations, our joy. We are a species cradled in a habitat. And by recognizing that we are an ecosystem citizen, just as connected to the trees as we are to each other, we can model our systems after ecosystems. We can create symbiotic relationships and systems of care. Because isn't that the point of society? To make life easier and more enjoyable for all of us?